I'm Dinda Elliott. I'm the executive director of the Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies, and so happy to see so many people here today. First, I want to thank Sam McLean, who is our communications manager, and this is absolutely his passion project. He's a Chinese film expert, and we're really honored to have him working with us, and he's the mastermind behind this River Elegy project. He has been carefully working on new English subtitles for this film and working with the folks who made the series in the first place. So we're really grateful to you, Sam. Thank you for, and for the entire film series. Thank you for that. So River Elegy was absolutely explosive when it first aired on CCTV in June of 1988. It was a painful critique of the very structure of Chinese culture, portrayed as a closed, backward, feudal society. It was something no one in China that was emerging from the brutal years of the Cultural Revolution had ever seen before. It was seen by more than 200 million viewers. The miniseries galvanized the general population into a deep soul-searching about China's future. Universities across China launched salons to discuss its content. The People's Daily even published transcripts of River Elegy. Important to remember that, given what happened afterwards. The People's Daily published transcripts of River Elegy, and references to the themes of the documentary began popping up everywhere on local newsstands. The extent of River Elegy's sheer iconoclasm is still shocking, especially if you compare it to the reverential and endless veneration of Chinese culture that's aired every night on Chinese TV today. In addition to the Yellow River, some of China's most beloved cultural symbols come under attack, even the Great Wall itself. And I just want to read a little quote from River Elegy about the Great Wall. To show you how kind of shocking what they were suggesting was at the time. Yet if somehow the Great Wall could speak, it would tell the descendants of the Chinese people that it is a huge monument to a tragedy created by historic destiny, that it cannot stand for strength, progress, or glory, but only isolation, conservatism, and ineffective defenses. Because of its massiveness and longevity, it has rooted self-glorification, arrogance, and self-deception into our national character. Oh, Great Wall, why should we still sing your praises? Kind of amazing, right? So I just wanted to say I'm also thrilled to have the chance to chat after the screening with two great scholars who bring real insights into the significance of this documentary series. Yasheng Huang isn't here yet, but he will be soon, now that he has his parking permit, is a professor of global economics and management at the MIT Sloan School, and also holds the Epoch Foundation Professorship of Global Economics and Management. From 2013 to 2017, he served as an associate dean in charge of MIT Sloan's global partnership programs and its action learning initiatives. Before that, he held faculty positions at the University of Michigan and at our own Harvard Business School. Professor Huang is the author of 11 books, not bad, in both English and Chinese, and his book, The Rise and Fall of the East, How Exams, Autocracy, Stability, and Technology Brought China Success and Why They Might Lead to Its Decline, was a 2023 Best Book of the Year by Foreign Affairs magazine. Most importantly for this evening's session, Yasheng was there in the late 1980s, and he can report what he saw and thought at the time. Rana is also joining us, and he is the S.T. Lee Chair in U.S.-Asia Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's the author of several books, including Forgotten Ally, China's World War II, which won the 2014 RUSI Duke of Westminster's Medal for Military Literature, and was named a Book of the Year in the Financial Times and The Economist. Not bad. His latest book is China's Good War. Is that your latest book? China's Good War. You've written so many, so can't keep track. China's Good War. Last one he remembers, okay. How World War II is shaping a new nationalism. Professor Mitter is one of the most prolific scholars I know, His writing on contemporary China has appeared recently in Foreign Affairs, the Harvard Business Review, The Spectator, The Critic, and The Guardian, and many, many other publications. He comments regularly on China in media and forums around the world, including at the World Economic Forum at Davos. Professor Mitter won the 2020 Medlicott Medal for Service to History, awarded by the UK Historical Association. And he previously taught at Oxford. He's also a fellow of the British Academy. So with no further ado, let's watch the part 1, part 2 of the film, and then we'll sit down for a conversation. And I will add that I also was based in Beijing in the 1980s, so I also saw some of what was happening as the Newsweek correspondent. So over to you, Sam. So I thought I'd just start quickly, since I was there, just kind of set the stage a little bit for what the context was when this film was shown. As I mentioned, I was living in Beijing at the time as the bureau chief for Newsweek magazine. And, it was, what I can say is that it was an absolutely thrilling time. In particular, 1988, actually, we were just talking to Wang Dan earlier today, one of the student leaders, and he was saying that he's writing a book, planning to write a book about 1988. I think that really is the year when so much was happening. But, just to set the stage, China had just emerged from the Cultural Revolution. Everybody was desperately searching for, why, for a dream, but a different kind of dream. But they weren't searching for a dream. They were searching for answers to why something so terrible had happened, what had gone wrong, and what a new path for the future might look like. And people's minds and eyes were just wide open. I mean, that was what was really remarkable about that time, because what they'd suffered was so horrendous that basically the whole society realized we have to find something new. And so that's the kind of context for this. It was a time of questioning and of exploration. And, just to give you an example of stuff that was going on around me when I was there, a group of young intellectuals returning from abroad with fresh ideas about capitalism. We're talking about, we just started Yasheng, so come join us. I was actually this sort of connects to you. I'm just setting the stage a little bit for what it felt like in Beijing when, here's Yasheng Huang, by the way. So, yay. So, this group of young intellectuals, returning from abroad where they'd been studying at Columbia and other universities, and they had fresh ideas about capitalism, and they were working on figuring out how to set up a stock market. It was absolutely crazy and thrilling. This was a time when people were still, by and large, wearing, navy blue and gray, but they were coming back to figure that out. There was a defiant rock musician named Cui Jian who captured a generation with a pounding love song of angst about having nothing to his name, but he had freedom. And he was saying, please come with me, to his girlfriend. But he had nothing to his name. And, an entire generation listened to that and were sort of thrilled by that very concept. Scholars and students were holding salons all around town about, once taboo subjects, such as private land ownership and even democracy. And yet, at the same time, there was a kind of frisson of danger in the air. Editorials in the People's Daily still suggested, you could tell that the old guard of revolutionaries were threatened by the change that was happening. And bubbling around them. And, you'll remember that, there was a campaign against so-called spiritual pollution, against ideas and fashions from abroad. And that campaign, it sent chills across society. More than a year before River Elegy even aired, the Liberal Party chief, Hu Yaobang, was expelled from the party for allegedly being too lenient on student protests that had cropped up around the country, together with a handful of China's top liberal thinkers. So you had this sort of very intense and exciting feeling, that was sort of everything was opening up, everybody was optimistic and full of hope, and yet there was this sense of kind of danger that something, the old guard might, counter attack or whatever. So I actually wanted to open it up to, you were there too, so I wanted to ask you to sort of share a little bit about Yasheng, help us set the stage a little bit and, tell us what the intellectual scene was like at that time in China. What kinds of ideas were people exploring?
Yeah, thank you, Dinda. Sorry I'm late. I had a class to teach, not about 1980s, but so I think a lot of the young people in China today don't know how the history you just gave.
Right.
About the 1980s and how it was so vibrant in many ways, not just in economic development, economic growth, but also in political explorations and ideological explorations and artistic explorations. So it was a sort of a brief decade of, so it ended in 89, so it was not even 10 years short of 1 year short of the decade. And also as the documentary shows, there was a lot of soul searching, and the questions that were debated and discussed at the time were all about why China fell behind. And that framed the discussions and also among academics framed the research questions. And the River Elegy is a very powerful expression of, I remember that it opened with a episode when some Chinese
They were rafting,
rafting,
right? Yeah,
rafters,
yeah.
right? So, and they wanted to do this ahead of the American rafters, and so that kind of a deep-seated raw nationalism, and the documentary proceeded to question that. Unlike today that will be like celebrated, right?
That's right.
And by the way, they died. So,
So
that opening, I just remember, very powerfully illustrated the individual, the fate of these individuals, and this nation, the abstract notion of the nation that they were supposed to defend, or the sense of honor and all of that. And so we can debate about whether or not the documentary got it right about the West, about China. But I think that's a secondary issue. The most important issue is that the documentary asks some really deep questions about which we may still don't have answers. But that's totally normal. Not asking questions is not normal.
Right.
Not getting answers is totally normal. So I just thought that is the power of that documentary.
So firstly, if we could just sort of drill down a little bit, I'm curious, like, what were you and your friends talking about at that time? What were you excited about?
So the excitement is about a way of looking at the world beyond the yellow earth, right? So the idea of the documentary is that, this nation is, for thousands of years, is inhabiting this environment that is defined by Yellow River, earth, and very kind of agricultural, inward-looking mentality. And then there's a whole blue ocean out there that is, about science and technology, about ideas and philosophy. So the excitement then was just visually see that contrast between these two worlds, and then relate that contrast to the things that were going on in China, right? So the salons that you talked about, and I participated in discussions about democracy, about economic system reforms. There were some really radical ideas.
And what did that describe that a little bit? Like, what did it feel like?
Well, so-
how many people in the room, and what kind of what was it like?
Were there snacks?
Were there snacks?
Were there snacks?
Yeah, yes, but they were not healthy. Yeah. So, what is really amazing about some of these activities? I mean, there are things taking place at universities.
Yeah.
I wasn't part of that.
Right.
But they were conferences and meetings involving establishment people.
Yeah.
Right. People from the government, people from the think tanks, and some of the participants of these conferences later on became senior officials in the Chinese government, mostly on the economic side. We were talking about corruption, we were talking about rent-seeking. I still have a sheet of the people who participated in that conference, and it's a who is
Who's
who
who? Yeah.
among the economic elites in China about 10 years ago and 15 years ago.
Wow.
So it's not a minor kind of a dark alley activity. It is right there in the open.
Right.
And the establishment intellectuals, establishment officials were thinking about how to change the system. That what I found.
Right.
to
At
be
the
incredibly
same time, I mean,
impressive.
at an event like that, would there have also been a little bit of a feeling of danger or
No,
not?
not at
No,
all.
it was totally
Not,
okay.
It was totally uninhibited.
Yeah, yeah.
And it was no, there was a discussion of Taiwan model.
Yeah.
There was a discussion of the. By the way, there were intense debates. There were people who argued for the authoritarian model, but the people who argued for the authoritarian model were people who believed that the authoritarian political model was most effective in carrying out economic reforms. And then there were others who argued, no, you need the political reforms to go to the next step in economic reforms. So at that time, in the mid-1980s, rural reforms already happened, quite successful. The next issue is how do you reform the cities, the industry, the SOEs, which is much more complicated, which requires discussions about the political system
Right.
and discussions about intellectual ideas.
Yeah. So just to add a little bit of nuance, or rather maybe the perspective of a foreign journalist in Beijing at the time. Now, obviously, being a foreigner means that, you know, Chinese that I'm interacting with, they are taking a certain risk. There's one thing for a bunch of Chinese scholars and intellectuals to be talking to each other, but then talking to a foreigner and kind of sharing your dirty laundry with the outside world is a different thing. So I remember literally sneaking around in darkness to go, as if, you know, I mean, here I am with my blonde hair or whatever, but in darkness to go and see Su Shaozhi, who was the head of the Marxism-Leninism Institute at the time, and he was a liberal reformer who was trying to sort of basically trying to figure out how can Marxism live with democracy, and, you know, what can we look to in tradition, et cetera. And he would, you know, he was willing to talk to me. He was taking a risk. So I would sort of sneak at night and go to his apartment, and there was certainly some danger there. He knew that it was dangerous. It wasn't dangerous for me, but it was dangerous for him. So that was going on. But that's, you know, a different side of the story, because that's him sharing something with a foreigner.
But I just want to, today Su Shaozhi, people like Su Shaozhi don't even exist in China.
Right.
So
Use the microphone.
yeah, so I understand the point.
Yeah.
But relative to today,
Yes.
right? Su Shaozhi, people like Su Shaozhi, Liu Bingyan, they were criticizing Deng Xiaoping by name,
Yeah.
and for a period of time they were okay.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So Rana, I wanted to ask you for, you know, further kind of perspective. The question, and talk about whatever you want to talk about, but the question of what is China, and what kind of role.
A nice small question there.
No, I'm not asking you that. But what role tradition should play has kind of resonated in China since the collapse of the Qing dynasty, and all the way to today. So why is that question so politically sensitive? It was so politically sensitive at that time, and it still seems to be incredibly politically sensitive.
Sure. So I think, Dinda, first of all, I admit you haven't asked me where I was in 1989.
Where were you? Why don't you start with that?
I was in Taiwan.
Were you? Okay.
Because it was the first year of my undergraduate study
Oh my gosh.
of Chinese. And I was not, sadly, in Beijing at the time that you both were, but we were watching Beijing, from our classroom in Cambridge, England, which is where we were studying at the time. And we certainly discussed Hoshang. In fact, that episode, the first one, Xinmeng, was shown, in the, frankly, rather kind of grotty common room of what was then called the Faculty of Oriental Studies. It still changed its name, but back in the day it was still under that title. And I think one of my fellow students even wrote his dissertation, actually, on Hoshang as well.
Wow.
So
Wow.
it was certainly a subject of discussion amongst that, admittedly, small number of British undergraduates. And then during that summer, we actually would have gone to Taiwan anyway for language training, but in fact, for reasons that will be very apparent, pretty much every other foreign student gravitated from the mainland pretty quickly to Taiwan as well. And that was some of the reports that we got about, what had been going on,
Yep.
Certainly after June 4th. So that was 1989. 88, of course, was when all this started. And I think that one of the things that I want to say is that, I don't know, I hope it's the same for you and others here who know something about it, but even now seeing the title sequence of Hoshang is an extraordinary experience. And actually the production values are something we should briefly just mention. I mean, the footage, the usage of the drum beats, the whole thing, it's clearly kind of a sense of occasion. It's very performative in all sorts of ways. And you can still see that in the way that it's all queued up and set up. The whole thing has this sort of slight air of bombast, you might say, but perhaps in a good cause. But the element that I want to bring up, because we haven't explicitly mentioned it yet, and actually I don't think it was much mentioned in the specific 2 episodes that we have, but it comes up in some of the later ones, which I know that we'll be showing later in the month, is the legacy of the May 4th movement. I think that's the element that I really want to kind of bring explicitly up front. As we now know, 4th May 1989 was a sort of culmination point of what became the worker and student demonstrations. They hadn't started in the summer of 88, but in retrospect, Hoshang was one of the showing of it on TV, was one of the events that brought together that tide of circumstances that eventually led to the Xuechao and also, I guess, the Gongrenchao as well, that marked that particular period. And the choice of exactly 70 days after that extraordinary date, the student demonstration of 4th of May 1919, which still has today tremendous resonance, was very important as part of that. And I think that's part of your question. They didn't mention May 4th, but you'll notice that they did mention, actually in modern Chinese form, 科学和民主, science and democracy. And of course, back in 1989, there was that sort of westernized phrasing, 在线上的线上, Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy, absolutely one of the key phrases of the May 4th movement, the idea that somehow science, in the sense of rational examination of often uncomfortable truths, and democracy, perhaps in the sense of multi-party elections, but perhaps more in the sense of popular participation in government, these were things that I think clearly mattered in 1919 and were felt not to have ultimately improved 70 years later by 1989, but to have gone via the detour that is critiqued with huge daring in the series. I mean, the phrase, I think, the false peasant emperor is used at one point. There's also, shots which show that there is the very last episode actually has, even with the kind of text written on the screen, the words 专制 as opposed to 民主, dictatorship versus democracy. And I think that, just to finish this thought and answer, I think, the heart of your question, Dinda, even now, 2 of the preoccupations that date from before the May 4th movement, from the late Qing, really, 富国强兵, and also, I think almost everyone here has Chinese, but some may not, the rich country and the strong army, the idea that one way or another, countries that succeed, which would include a China that has become, in the view of the filmmakers, degenerate, needs in some ways to become rich, economically strong, also in some sense to build up its security. And these are preoccupations that exist in the late Qing, and they're still very much there today. Today's China, I would say, very, very different in its political tenor from the era of He Shang, is still obsessed, of course, with becoming rich, has become much richer than it was then, but it's still ongoing, and is very, very obsessed with the idea of Qiangbing, the strong army. That is less explicitly in He Shang, but that whole beginning with the idea of nationalism, with the idea of China being a country that is, emotionally raw, that wants to push back. I mean, on a day when tariffs have been pushed to, what is it? Last
125.
I was about to say, well, I checked at what I think of as cocktail hour, maybe others don't, that it was 125. Probably by the time we get to evening digestives, it may be up to an even higher level. But you can see why even now that question of both Fuguo and Qiangbing might be very relevant even today, even in very different circumstances from those of He Shang.
Right. So I actually had a conversation a month or so ago with Su Xiaokang, who was one of the writers of He Shang. And he said, and his story is he was one of the writers, and he was very much blacklisted, one of the top 10 most wanted people, I think, and left China in 1989 and has been in exile ever since, basically lives in California. But he said that he feels that the questions raised in He Shang, in River Elegy, have not yet been resolved.
Right.
That is still totally relevant. And what's so interesting, like especially watching these first two episodes today, you feel like, well, wait a second. I mean, China today is so modern, seems so modern, and so open. Xi Jinping is the one who's in favor of globalization, unlike our own president here, who's pulling back from the world and starting battles with the entire world.
But that's a low bar.
So, well, it is a low bar. Forget that. But the point being that China seems very open in many ways. So why do you guys think that? I mean, is this still relevant? And if so, why?
Do you want to go first?
Do you think it's true that the sort of
No,
fundamental questions have not been dealt with, even though China is so kind of, at least on the surface, open to the world, et cetera?
I think the Chinese economy is more open. That's true compared with 1980s. But it's very important to make a distinction between different kinds of openness. So I am interested in the documentary not only because I was there to watch it when it was aired, but also because I have been doing work on the 1980s and compare with what happened later on. The 1980s, part of the openness in the 1980s is the part that is not very well known to the outside world. Definitely not to me. Before I began to, even when I was in China, I wasn't aware of this aspect of openness, which is in rural China.
Okay.
The financial reforms were unfolding on a very large scale. Village elections were introduced and implemented. They were local stock market reforms. They were local land reforms, experiments. They were local, and in Zhejiang, they were peasants who lost land and sued the government and won the judgment. So in that sense, 1980s, at the time of He Shang, was much more open than China today in terms of those aspects. It's just that they took place in the rural part of the economy, in the rural part of the society, and we didn't really know much about it. And the data are not very good, and the information was not very well developed. So you really have to dig very deep to know that was going on. And the reason, and so there's a connection between that part of what's happening in China in the 1980s and the documentary. The rural reforms in China required some degree of political openness, right? Because it required deference to the rural Chinese decisions and their activities, right? So the policymakers at that time were incredibly progressive in the sense that actually Wan Li, the vice premier in charge of agriculture, said this explicitly. He said, if we see our policy being resisted by the peasants, should we say the peasants are wrong or our policy is wrong?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
It is an incredible way of thinking about the role of the government. And then he proceeded to answer that question. He said, I think it's our policy that is wrong, right? Look at COVID-19 control, right? The quarantine, right? For 2 years, that devastated the economy, and yet that policy persisted. The political campaigns you mentioned, anti-spiritual campaign and all of that, it lasted 28 days. In 1983, I think there were 2 campaigns. One was anti-
精神污染.
and
then
what's the other?
自由化.
Yeah, okay. So I forgot which one was
Yeah,
1983,
yeah.
but the one in 1983, when spiritual pollution, when that campaign was announced by the government, the Ministry of Agriculture came out and said, oh, this is really about spiritual issues. Since agriculture is not spiritual, we won't proceed and implement that campaign. And then another ministry said, oh, we're concerned about industry and economic things. This is really about spirit. And then and then the Ministry of Culture came out and said, well, it's about kind of a particular kind of spirit. It's really not about our spirit. And it was canceled in 28 days, right? So 1980s, in terms of politics, was the most open era of PRC history. And so in that sense, China was ahead of 1990s, ahead of the 2000s, and definitely ahead of today.
Good. A little addition to that. First of all, I suppose with the idea of like the temple of the Nongsheng, you could have a kind of spiritual agricultural combat back in the old days. It's worth remembering, because it does actually turn up again briefly in one of the episodes of Heshang, that this show was broadcast at a time when the Soviet Union was still a reality. And it was not apparent in 1988 or even into 1989 that within a small number of years, a single-digit number of years, the Soviet Union, this huge fact of global geopolitical reality for 3/4 of a century, would disappear off the face of the earth. I mean, to I think one or two of our students here of the younger generation, the Soviet Union is like sort of, Bohemia or Narnia or something, kind of vaguely known about existed, but not a reality in any sense.
But they were not taxed. There was no tariff.
Well, yes, there's no tariffs on them, exactly. So at least that was different at that point. But at this point, for much of the Western world, but also I think within China itself, there was an understanding, first of all, that Gorbachev, who had come to power a couple of years earlier in 1985, was a different sort of Soviet leader. And there's a brief clip, as I say, of him shaking hands, actually, because the very still tentative rapprochement between the Soviets and the PRC was beginning to, rev up at this particular stage. And of course, it was Gorbachev's visit in 1989 that created some of the stimulation for the demonstrations, and also the foreign visitors like yourself being there. I think Dinda, in some measure, came because there was a Gorbachev visit, and it was such a big deal. And then, of course, because of the student demonstration, you had to take him in through the back door, which made them extremely unhappy. But in terms of the wider significance for Heshang, most of that generation that came just before the perhaps the filmmakers and the younger students had, of course, been brought up with Soviet norms as the way of understanding the revolution, the way of understanding progress and modernity. And the idea, which in some senses seems natural or almost old hat, there's images of American cities. The one I particularly like is the theme park with the roller coaster. It's like Epcot or somewhere with people going up and down. All this sort of business was remarkably transgressive at the time, because it was not just about saying, here is America and here is a place that we need to embrace as the blue ocean and so forth, but also existed still in a context where the opposition, in a sense, was still the Soviet Union, and that form of socialism was clearly rejected. But the idea that China was going to have to embrace something else that would tread the path of something that was officially, at least, socialism, but actually in some ways had to produce a different sort of model, was a dilemma that didn't exist after 1989, after the 1990s. I think that accounts in some part for the openness that you're talking about, because actually when you have three pathways that you have to debate between, you have to have an awful lot of really very in-depth discussions. And I think we shouldn't forget that the question of what was happening across the board in the Soviet Union and why that wasn't right was also still part of that discussion at the time.
I will add, I can't resist, I will add one little story that attests to your comment about the bourgeois liberalization campaign not going down to the countryside, et cetera. So I guess you're talking about the spiritual pollution campaign, but also applies to the bourgeois liberal. So as a journalist based in Beijing, I wanted to, when the bourgeois liberalization, anti-bourgeois liberalization campaign came by, I wanted to see what was happening in the countryside. So the way it worked is you had to make a request to the foreign affairs office in the provincial town that you want to visit, et cetera, et cetera. And they're, of course, miserable when they receive such a request from any foreign journalist. It's bad news for them no matter what. But anyway, somehow I got permission to visit some village. I think it was I'm not sure, I think it might have been Henan. And so as you go to if you're a foreign journalist back in those days, you arrive in the provincial capital, and there you meet with the Foreign Affairs Office, and you pick up a couple of people who are going to be traveling with you to the place. Right. Then you get to the, Xianchang, the county town, and you've got a few more people who are joining the delegation. And by the time we get down to the village, I've got like 12 Chinese officials following me to the village, right? And this is a village that it seems has never seen a foreigner before in the first place. And so, there are just flocks and flocks of people all over the place. But I'm showing up, and they usher me into this farmer's house, into this home. And this farmer is sitting there, a bunch of chairs around the room, and the officials are sort of squeezing into the room, and I'm sitting there trying to have a conversation with this poor farmer who is surrounded by all these terrifying officials. And I'm asking the farmer, so tell me, what do you think about the bourgeois liberalization campaign? And the farmer looks at, like a deer caught in the headlights and says, well, the reason we're supposed to support bourgeois liberalization is, and you could see the officials kind of going, stop. And I'm just thinking, this poor farmer, their life is flying by them, whatever. And hopefully the farmer's okay. But clearly the message had not gotten down to that village that they were supposed to be fighting bourgeois liberalization. Anyway, I think we should open up to questions from the floor. I hope there are questions.
We should open up and reform, I think.
We should definitely open up. 改革开放, absolutely. We should definitely open up and reform. So questions, anybody? Any questions?
Yes, test. I'm curious.
Can you say who you are? Introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Jing. I'm a journalist.
You don't have to stand up.
Oh.
You're welcome to if you want to.
中国记者讲起来了。
Yeah.
Exactly.
I'm curious how many people in China saw Heshang, and what did they think about it? Did newspapers or journals talk about the documentary, and what did they say?
Yeah.
What kind of impact did it have?
Well, what I read was that 200 million people watched it. I don't know if that's an accurate number, but that's what I read.
It's very difficult to get ratings from CCTV, particularly on a show that's now banned, and it's difficult to know how many people are watching. But I think very few people think it was fewer than tens of millions of viewers, and I've heard 100. But we're talking about something very significant. I mean, in those days, there's like 2 TV stations in China, CCTV1, which was, the main station and so on, and maybe 1 or 2 other ones. So it's not like there's a whole bunch of other things to watch in 1988. So, it's large.
Yeah. So, and what was it? Do you remember sort of what the reaction was? Do you remember people were talking about it?
Yeah,
It was,
so I don't know the number,
Yeah,
but the
yeah,
impact was very substantial impact among the intellectuals, and it was also very controversial, right? We know that now that it was subsequently banned, and Su Xiaokang, I don't think he suffered simply because of the documentary. It was really June 4th,
Yeah.
right? But then the documentary emerged as an issue during the June 4th, in the aftermath of the June 4th.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't think the number is the relevant metric, is really the impact. The impact
Yeah.
was huge.
Did
Yeah.
you watch it yourself, Yasheng?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
right. So at the time, Su Xiaokang has said that there was a struggle at the highest levels behind the scenes about the TV show.
Yeah.
That basically, the question was whether they should show it or not. And, Zhao Ziyang, apparently the party secretary at the time, apparently saw it and kind of felt like, you can remind me because you'll remember the details, but felt like, kind of looks okay to me.
Yeah, there are sort of differing accounts on this, but according to Su Xiaokang, Zhao Ziyang saw it, and because of his own affection for traditional Chinese values, he actually was not very positive towards Heshang. But later, once it did air and it became extremely popular, he and Deng Xiaoping saw Heshang as kind of a political bargaining chip against the more conservative elements of the party. And so by supporting it, they could kind of paint other oppositional parties as being more conservative and them being the reformers and the more liberal thinkers.
Right. Okay.
Oh boy, you choose, Dinda.
No, go ahead. Okay, I see a woman here. They hand up, and then we'll get around the room.
Thank you, professors. I'm Xiuwen from Kennedy School. So I think this is about like one generation before me because my parents are like college students in the 90s. But I still feel like all the content are very relevant. So I'm curious because I know it's banned after like 1989. So do you think the official narratives like take this up again later on, or like if not, how does narrative continue to be a consensus among the intellectuals?
Do you mean the narrative of Heshang or the...
Yeah, I think mostly all the reflections and complex feelings towards the traditional history and also all the struggles after 1840s.
Yep. Okay. So I think there's something else. I mean, again, one of the things that makes Heshang so rich, I think, is that it brings back many threads in the development of Chinese modernity without necessarily explicitly saying so. And in this case, I'm thinking, someone described it as being basically a kind of combination of movie clips and Lu Xun, because actually the idea that Confucianism and China's tradition, in big quote marks, is the source of China's trouble and distress is actually a large part of the intellectual basis of the show. And that, again, is a direct inheritance of the very radical part of the May 4th tradition that somehow, Lu Xun, the great Chinese fiction writer, writing Kuang Ren Zhi, the Diary of a Madman, in which essentially Confucianism is equated with Chiren, cannibalism. I mean, it's a pretty savage metaphor. That isn't quite used there, but actually you saw the little clip from the Zheng Yi story turned into film, Lao Jing, with the kind of man being kind of buried in the ground and so forth. And you can see these sort of metaphors emerge there with this idea of the repression of the new and progressive by the weight of China's tradition. After 1989, I think that message became much, much harder to put forward, assuming that you wanted to do so, because it was associated with the kind of May 4th elements that had also led to the student demonstrations. one element of Hoshang that absolutely continues in broadcast and other forms is that strong sense of nationalism, which of course is, flagged up right at the beginning of episode 1. And actually, Jeremy Barmay, the great Australian scholar of China, who has written actually extensively about this and other series, contrasts it with a perhaps less well remembered, rather kind of iconic series of the early 90s called, I don't know if anyone here remembers it or saw it, called Beijing Ren Zai Niu Yue, the Beijing Man in New York, which basically, I think the scene which Barmay puts forward as a kind of point of contrast is a scene in that TV show where the Beijing man who goes to New York earns a lot of money, and he basically hires a young woman, I think a sex worker, in fact, to lie on a bed in a hotel so that he can throw dollar bills at her and have her shout, I love you," at him. This is, and again, the scene there is meant to be, again, with echoes that, go all the way up to this afternoon, of that continued sort of conflict between China and America as countries that admire each other and detest each other and are obsessed with each other as well. So that dynamic is visible in Hoshang, but it's a dynamic of envy, of concern, of, they've done well, we need to do that way. 5 years later, with Beijing Man in New York, it's like, they're not all that, we can do better. And I think that is the way in which the narrative that you're talking about develops over that time.
I do believe that there is a message in Hoshang that is almost diametrically opposite from what later on emerged as the official narrative. And the narrative in Hoshang, maybe implicitly, is asking the question why China fell behind, and then blame the Chinese traditional culture as a reason. Whereas the later narrative celebrates Chinese growth and development as proof of Chinese superiority in some ways, the need to defend the Chinese culture, right? And so I think the June 4th has a lot to do with that change of the narratives. The conventional explanation is that June 4th essentially bankrupted communism as an ideology, as a unifying ideology. So the regime needed to create a different ideology, and that's nationalism, right? So then you point to nationalism, you point to tradition, you point to history as a source of development, as rather than as a hindrance to it. The globalization that has happened is more on the operational side, on the technical side, rather than on the ideological side. And in that sense, Hoshang is quite different from that kind of technical economic globalization. It is about cultural globalization, embracing the Western culture, embracing the blue ocean culture, and rejecting the yellow earth culture. I mean, this is probably my very simplistic understanding of the documentary, but at least that was the impression that I got when I first watched that documentary.
But certainly, I mean, some people argue that 2008 was the real turning point in terms of China's perspective on the West and the United States, that as the Western economy collapses, et cetera, and Wang Qichan, famously says to Hank Paulson, our teacher is no longer looking so good. And that at that moment, China and Chinese policymakers sort of felt like China has the answers.
Just to be historically correct,
okay.
Wang Qichan may have that view. The performance of the Chinese government after that is exactly copying the worst aspect of American system. If you calculate the debt to GDP ratio, before 2008, it was practically flat, right, around 120% of the GDP. The whole thing about the financial crisis in 2008 was over-leveraging, right, and excessive debt. And then after 2008, the debt to GDP ratio shot up to today about 290% of the GDP.
Right.
So it is always ironic when I hear people say, oh, China actually went in the opposite direction. They actually copy the part of the U.S. model they should have copied.
Right, exactly. I get it. And of course, the West celebrated and thanked China and has, for saving the world in a way with its stimulus package in 2008. And now, of course, criticizes China for its high debt and, says it needs to fix that problem.
I won't ask at this point, perhaps, whether or not, Yasheng and Dinda, you think that China is currently selling large numbers of UST bills in the bond market. But I wonder if I could add a note perhaps from the Qing dynasty, less about the bond markets. In terms of the shift, again, I think the question about the shift of narrative is very important. Another phrase that, again, has a much, well, obviously it emerges in the Qing dynasty. I think it's Feng Guifen who originally says it, which is the idea of 中体西用, the kind of Chinese learning as essence, but Western learning for utility or practicality. I think Heshang maybe marks the last moment in the contemporary era when it's not that. I think it's 西体西用. It's like, not only should we have Western practicality, we need to actually re-educate ourselves as if we were Westerners as well. And that, the kind of unease about that is what runs through all 6 episodes of Heshang. Well, okay, perhaps we should do this. If so, we lose the dragon, we lose the river, but then do we lose ourselves? I mean, it's your question, what is China in that case? And I think after 1989, and all the way through to the present day, it snapped right back to, okay, sometimes we're going to have some xiyong, but, probably in conversation with Hank Paulson on Western bond markets, whatever it might be. But when it comes to the essence, actually, we have our own thing, and we should stick with that. And when I go to, Beijing or to China to hear debates today, it strikes me the debates are much more similar to the ones in the late Qing, about wanting to keep a kind of cultural authenticity while using the modern world for the benefit of China, and not so much like the kind of Lu Xun-esque idea of actually need to chuck everything out in the most radical way, which Heshang, to some extent, I think actually shared.
Right. I think that's absolutely right. More questions? How about over here? And Sam, I'm going to make you run to the other side of the room. Getting in your steps.
Where was it?
Yeah.
Thank you. I think it's a remarkable
Can you
idea.
introduce yourself, please?
Bing Wang from Harvard Graduate School of Design. I think it's a remarkable idea to really review, Heshang at this stage, given the political, and kind of context, cultural context. But I guess there are 2 questions. One is, how should we really view this documentary? There are, storylines embedded in this documentary. One is the constant search of identity. And I see that as, it's going to, it's a reflective search that's going to be accompanying any countries that has long history, and how to build a modernity that has the Chinese characteristics. That's going to be going forward, not just for China, for some other countries that has, non-Western culture and, long history. That's always going to be there. So Heshang is one of, exploration of that. And another element is that in retrospect, if we look back, and to see that maybe Heshang was just at that stage, it's like a teenager. That's the question that some of the intellectuals in China that asked. But they, continue to grow. And now they're trying to go search this direction, search that direction, and they try different things. And maybe even now they haven't really found an answer for that question. And years later, when we look back, we're going to say, okay, all these are the efforts. They looked at Western culture, they looked at Western ideology, thinking that might be a solution, and then maybe 2008 gave them the answer that they start to have doubts. And maybe, so my question is, at today's stage, and when we think about all the changes that China had experienced politically, economically, ideologically, from the stage of Heshang, and what's the significance of this soul searching for a country of that size and with so many politicized environment today?
Thoughts?
Sure, I'll give a quick thought, although I think that, you know, Yasheng is probably much more qualified than me to say. I think that instinct, that compulsion almost to keep searching for identity in that sense is something that has been there for a very long time. And I think it's no accident that one of the great, sadly now no longer with us, interpreters from the Western tradition of Chinese history, Jonathan Spence, wrote a standard book called The Search for Modern China. And I think that was a very astute title, like many of the things that Spence did, was very, very astute in many ways. And if you think about, I mean, you know, that first chapter, Xunmeng, the searching for a dream, or, you know, the Xungen, the root-searching movement, which is also part of that wider change, or Tansuo, exploration, which was one of the big literary and scholarly journals of that period too. This sense of wanting to investigate and explore more, I think, continues to be the manifestation of this unsettledness in terms of identity and what it is. My sense today is that in some ways that question has entered a very, I'm trying to think of it, I'm going to use the word, quite bleak phase in a sense. Why? Because I think that much of where you now see it is on social media in China, and a very great number of the continuing themes that emerge on social media these days are ones that are in some ways very, very disillusioned and very questioning. So if Heshang is a program that on the one hand is deeply questioning and deeply concerned about the future of China, but is also very optimistic in many ways about what's going to come, I don't get that vibe from what I can see, and indeed, you know, perhaps when one talks even in China or with people who are working and living in China today, I think we all know the kind of cliched things that have become well known, the lying flat, the runxue, you know, study of running away, all these sorts of things, but they speak more to a really strong sense that actually the narrative, again, taking that term, doesn't lead forward in a meaningful sense. I mean, just to take one example, and perhaps to throw to Yasheng, who I think have a lot to say about all of this. If you are trying to find, I think, one thing that is underpinning the sense of disillusionment, it is economic malaise. I think the fact that younger people, and of course don't forget Heshang was made by some very, very young people at a very exciting time, those equivalent young people today, I think, seem to find themselves in a situation where in some senses material life and culture is much more comfortable, as you were saying, Dinda, than it would have been in the 1980s and certainly than the 1970s. But the capacity to be able to convert that into the next phase and what happens after that, I think looking at that is much, much harder to see from that generation's point of view. I don't think that makes China unique. I mean, we see something similar, I think, in the United States and much of Western Europe. It's a global phenomenon. But I think China's manifestation of it is, in a sense, more acute because it's linked to a very strong party-driven narrative that we are the only way forward. You need to trust us. You need to do what we say. And that the social contract that has produced that kind of economic bargain over the last few decades, to many now seems to be in grave danger or even possibly to be broken.
Right. Yeah. What kind of soul searching do you see happening?
I think that Heshang, I think one unique attribute to Heshang is that it qualifies as a soul searching. And I would say that about Heshang more than lots of other things that have come out of China since 1989. So I think the idea of search is not so much that you magically identify the solutions and the answers. The process of the search itself is as important as finding the answers. And I think it's very important that for us to be aware of the following, which is in the 1980s, There were people on the liberal side. There were people on the ultra conservative side, right? So the ideological space was much wider before 1989 than after 1989.
Right.
And I believe in today's China, today, right, 2025, that space was minimum, if it exists at all. So I don't see He Shang as a sort of kind of early stage kind of exploration. It is asking some really meaningful questions, that the questions that are still generate debates in a more free environment, and the ability of the He Shang to ask those questions and to be aired on CCTV for a broad audience rather than the small seminar rooms and or the university campuses. To me, this is remarkable, and I cannot think of any other episode after 1989 that kind of has that level of soul searching that I saw with He Shang. So, in the 1980s, the conservative intellectuals were just as vocal as the liberal ones. Right? To me, this is a normal society. I tend to go on the liberal side, but I believe that it is very important to have the discussion space for the views that are totally opposite from the liberal views. And we see He Shang because it was banned, but there were lots of other expressions that were totally on the opposite side. To me, this is a sign of healthy society.
I think we have time for one more question. So I don't know how to, go ahead.
My name is Guo Rui. I'm a visiting scholar. I wonder, oh, by the way, Professor Huang, I think the message was very powerful. I didn't remember exactly seeing the content, but many years later when I saw it again, I recall it was from a very small, like 12-inch TV screen. Just that media was very powerful. But my question is more about the content of He Shang. There seems to be a narrative of utopia. So instead of asking for communism, there was modernity as a sort of destiny built in it. But Professor Mitter also mentioned about a rich country and powerful army. There's also, along with that modernity, there's also a narrative almost like a social Darwinism in it. I just curious about your reflections and views on these.
I'd be happy to talk about the. Yeah. Okay. So sorry. Yeah. I always try to lean back. That's how I watch He Shang, by the way. Yeah, thumping. No, I think your critique is absolutely correct, right? Utopian and some naivete in the documentary. But let's be fair to the people who produced the documentary. It was the early phase of Chinese reforms and open door policy. And I think they wrote the script more from their understanding of the Chinese culture and then identify something that is different and the opposite from their understanding of the Chinese culture. And then they arrive at the utopian view of the West. I mean, I actually think the West is much more complicated than the documentary showcases, right? So, I mean, that's West too, right? Marxism is Western. So this kind of a broad brush of the West as blue ocean and contrast with the yellow earth of the Chinese culture, I think we can really debate and criticize and cripple. But I think still, I don't want to take away the incredible value and the contributions of the documentary aired at the time it was. I think I would have preferred to see follow-up discussions and documentaries that directly challenge Heshang, rather than banning the documentary, right? So I celebrate people who challenge Heshang from a conservative perspective, from Chinese traditional cultural perspective, but I cannot celebrate censorship and banning of it, even if I disagree with it. And going back to Bing's question about teenager, right? Teenagers ask naive questions. Well, some adults still ask naive questions, but
Hey, what? Excuse me.
but they grow. You have to. So if you just shut down the teenagers' naive questions and not allow them to grow, you don't get mature questions. So I think this is the level of the discourse in China today. You shut down these teenager questions, and you don't allow the maturation and further development and the deepening of explorations. And today, when you hear, especially on the social media, the Chinese views of the West, Chinese views of America, many of those views are incredibly uneducated and not very deep, right? And even from some establishment intellectuals, I think their view is quite simplistic. That's because we don't really have, because of the censorship, we don't have this further development, further maturation.
Yeah, no, I think I'd agree with all of that. I mean, you mentioned social Darwinism, and I think that is a very important thread that certainly runs through that whole May 4th period, both before and afterwards. And I think that the underlying assumptions that somehow competition between peoples is zero-sum. The very first scene of Heshang, the need to beat Ken Warren and make sure that a Chinese team gets down the river first is, I think, in some senses, an echo or afterburner of exactly that sort of sense. I think the difference. The other thing to say though is I absolutely agree with Yasheng about the kind of need for debate. I mean, before June 4th, there were, of course, all these salons and debates about Heshang. I mean, there's a whole Heshang sort of craze about the show, in which people were actually very critical of it in many ways, yeah, sure, but absolutely openly did, want to take it on board rather than try to sort of hide it or censor it in that sense. I don't think we've completely lost in China the capacity for certain quite complex discussions of things, but I think they manifest in different ways, and they're definitely in a more narrow sort of environment. Let me just give one example, because we're near the end, and it's one of my favorites, and it has to do with TV as well, but from a very different era, from the 2020s. How many people here have seen, I've mentioned it to you guys before, but not everyone, Kuang Biao, the show that was big hit, Knockout, a couple of years ago, about a kind of corrupt policeman in rural China. Well, no, nobody? Okay, you want to get to ETE.
Somebody up there has.
Yeah,
yep.
Someone's there. I say, okay, did you like it? Yes, good. Okay, so I don't know what the reason you liked it was the reason lots of Chinese viewers liked it, but basically it's a show about a corrupt policeman. And it's interesting because, again, it's shown on mainstream Chinese TV. It was a big hit, but it wasn't. But it was dealing with a difficult social issue. But it turned out that, rather against the wishes, I suspect, of the censorship authorities, the villain actually turns out to be the most popular character, and this is reflected in social media discussion as well. It's a sign that however much you try and clamp things down, people, I think, will still find ways in which they can interpret artworks. And actually, I'll leave my thoughts on that note. Heshang is many things, but actually it's a work of art, really. It is an extraordinary piece of thinking and crafting of ideas and images. And actually a different way, Kuang Biao is as well, perhaps a more populist form of art rather than elitist. But it's a way of creating something that's not melodrama, that has complexity to it. And if that thread remains somewhere in Chinese media production, the battle is perhaps not wholly lost.
Well, I think that's fantastic. So I want to first thank you all for coming and watching and listening, and And I also wanted to say, following up on what Bing said, to watch this film at this moment in global history, at a time when essentially universal values are under attack from all fronts, and especially here in the United States. But it's a great moment to reflect on this film again. And I want to thank these wonderful professors for sharing your insights on what it felt like back then, what it means today. So thank you all so much.